All right, y'all, I'm back covering Al Bielek. We're gonna do part two. We're gonna get into it. Al Bielek. He's talking about Nikola Tesla going to college and then or studying engineering. His autobiography. This is Al Bielek's autobiography. In his life, his early life as Ed Cameron.
Monitoring the classes without being a matriculated student, being the normal tuition. And in 1879, his father died. And of course, therein the funds were cut off. He could not continue on in school formally. So he went to work first in the telephone system works around in Bucharest, I believe. Tried to continue his schooling on the side, as the saying goes, monitoring the classes without being a matriculated student, being the normal tuition. Considered very brilliant by his parents, not only his parents, but most particularly by his professors. And then in 1882, he went to Paris, went to work for the Edison Works in Paris. He was there until 1884. During this entire period of time, he had argument after argument with his professors because he was, at that point, even so brilliant that he envisioned new forms of electricity. DC, of course, was the common thing at that time, developed by Thomas Alva Edison. And, of course, Edison's works were all over the world at that time, and they had a major installation in Paris, which he went to work with. And the head of the engineering works in Paris considered Tesla very brilliant. Tesla decided he wanted to come to the United States in 1884 for greener pastures, if you will. And he got a letter of introduction from the works manager in Paris to Thomas Alva Edison of Menlo Park, New Jersey. So he bid his farewells and got on, went to England, and of course got on one of the regular steamboat trips. And didn't have much money. Someplace along the way, he lost a suitcase of clothes. The only thing he managed to keep and to survive on his trip was a book of poetry he liked, the letter of introduction to Edison, and literally 4 cents in his pocket. This was, of course, the way he arrived in New York. So what does he do? He tries to get temporary work in order to survive, and eventually meets Thomas Edison in New Jersey and gives him the letter of introduction. Tesla was, Edison was impressed by this. Tesla was perhaps not quite so impressed with Edison as Edison was with Tesla because of the letter. And he says, tell me, Mr. Tesla, what are some of the things you have done and what are you interested in? So he told Edison about his ideas, in which he envisioned a new form of electricity, AC, alternating current. Edison, of course, having been the, shall we say, the principal proprietor in terms of building hardware, all DC motors, DC generators, a lighting system, which of course didn't care whether it was AC or DC, but having invented the light bulb and a few other things, that is the incandescent lamp, he saw in Tesla a man who was, to his idea, argumentative, but nonetheless brilliant. Tesla felt that he had no chance to be with Edison and was about to walk out, and Edison said, no, we may not agree on some things, but I need all of the engineers and good engineers I can get. Report 7 a.m. in the morning for work. So we did. The first project that Tesla worked on, and the only one apparently that he worked on during this period of time, was one that Edison gave him, how to stop the arcing of the brushes in DC motors. It was quite a problem at that time. And we're talking in the period around 1884. Obviously, there's been a great deal of change and progress since, but this was the beginning of progress, if you will. And he also promised Tesla that if he completed this project in time, he would give him a $50,000 bonus. Well, of course, Tesla went to work. He wanted to establish his own laboratory. And of course, he couldn't do it without money.
It's cool how he says this is the beginning of progress. We learn later, that's 1884. There was a lot that's happening in the late 1800s, New Thought movement, things of that sort. It's funny, 1884. In 1981, the Law of One comes out, and they say that Tesla was a wanderer, and that he came in to light the world up. And, you know, So I just think it's cool. I think it's cool. You're gonna see how everyone, is fighting to get their hands on Tesla. It's cool. Here we go.
So he completed the work in proper time. Everything was according to what Edison wanted. So he asked Edison for the bonus. Edison sort of laughed. He says, bonus? He says, you don't understand the American sense of humor. And Tesla looked at him and says, no, I don't, and walked out the door and went back to work digging ditches, quite literally. He had to survive. And, of course, he had no resources at that point. While digging ditches, of course, the word got around New York that he was a brilliant man digging ditches. You had a great deal of capability in the electrical field. The first person that contacted him was the then head of and owner of the telegraph company in New York. And he approached Tesla and says, Mr. Tesla, I would like to have you go to work for me. I've heard about your ideas for AC motors and generators. How much money would it take to establish a laboratory? And Tesla thought for a moment and says, well, I think I could establish a working laboratory and go to work for about $35,000. This man, being the president of the telegraph company at the time, wrote him a check on the spot for $35,000, or so goes the history that is recorded, and says, go to work. So he got himself a building and started building his laboratory. He built some of the earliest motors and generators. And interest at that time, when he arrived in the year 1884, was the year that the Institute of Electrical Engineers was founded in New York City. Of course, it persists to this day and is now known as the IEEE, Electrical and Electronic Engineering today, but at that time it was the Institute of Electrical Engineers. Tesla became a fixture there in that he gave many lectures. And at one of them, he demonstrated his AC system of AC power, generators, the lighting, and so forth. A very impressive demonstration. And in the audience, unknown to him at the time, was a man known as George Westinghouse, of Westinghouse Air Brake Company, Westinghouse Rail Car Company, a man who already had a lot of money and was very successful in business. Westinghouse liked what he heard. He says to Tesla after the lecture's over, would you join me for dinner at the Waldorf? And he said, of course. They discussed the history. They discussed the possible future for Tesla. Tesla at this point already had 20 patents assigned for AC power, AC theory, and the whole 9 yards of AC equipment, issued patents. And he says, how much do you want for all 20 patents if you sign them to me? What kind of money is involved? Well, I'm sure they negotiated for a period of time, but they finally worked out a deal, which history says Westinghouse gave him a check outright for assignment of all of his patents to the Westinghouse Company for $1 million cash. Yeah. This was in approximately 1887.
1887.
A lot of money in those days.
That has to be like.
Oh, yes. And we'll give you a royalty, $1 per horsepower for every AC motor and generator we build. But Tesla was very much in business over that. And, of course, his laboratory expanded, and he continued his work. Well, in 1888-89, there was a commission appointed out of England to see who would build the first hydroelectric power station in the United States. And I might add, during this period of time, there was a great deal of animosity between Tesla and Edison. Edison never lost a chance to prove, perhaps, or attempt to prove that Tesla's AC system was really very dangerous. Of course, Edison wanted to continue using DC power and generating DC equipment, hardware, and keep the whole DC system going. Tesla won the contest to build the first hydroelectric power system at Niagara Falls, which was completed about 1891, AC power, of course. And because of the nature of AC, you can use transformers. You cannot with DC, obviously. To those, of course, who understand electricity, transformers and the whole 9 yards of this. You can use a transformer, step up the voltage, and transfer the power via high voltage and lower current at very great distances. The first city in...
So Al Bielek is a scientist. He actually, the reason why Tesla is so important in his life, you're going to find out here soon, is they worked together later on during World War II on the Philadelphia experiment. So Yeah.
In the country, the power from the new Niagara power plant was, of course, the city of Buffalo, 35 miles away. Well, that was a great accomplishment in those days. We don't think anything of that today, but this was the beginning of progress. Tesla was busy doing many other things, and in his history, he actually had 400 patents issued to him. And this information is available at the Belgrade Museum today. He was also involved in other things besides the AC power. He became
crazy how influential Tesla was when you think about it. You just saw, or you still see how everyone was fighting to get their hands on Tesla, from Edison to the banker to Westinghouse to J.P. Morgan. And I mean, I like the fact it's just crazy. It's crazy how you see how everyone's fighting to get their hands on him, how important he was. His mission to light up the world, give us free electricity. Didn't quite completely work out how he wanted to, but we all know how pivotal Tesla is. And heck, I wonder if, sometimes I wonder if Elon Musk is reincarnation of Tesla, but we don't know for sure. I don't know. But long story short, Tesla, Donald Trump recently just won the presidency for the 47th president of the United States of America. And his uncle, John Trump, was reportedly the one who got Tesla's files upon Tesla's death. And Tesla, we're going to hear that he said that he's made contact with people off-world. And later, I've heard from other sources that he discovered time travel or things of that sort, ways to time travel. And there's that book that we've heard about, The Adventures of Baron Trump. When Baron Trump goes back to it's crazy, 1890, this time period. Man. Okay, let's keep on playing.
Involved with the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. He supplied the power, generating all the power for the exposition. And there are photos were taken of the Westinghouse Tesla system, which I had, believe it or not, slides taken in 1892. A little bit foggy, but they are of interest to show the history of that exposition. In fact, they had a great exhibit there of Tesla and Westinghouse. And GE, which was, of course, backing a certain man by the name of Edison, also had an exhibit. In 1893, Tesla exhibited and tested and showed publicly a radio-controlled model boat. Now, this is the use of a radio system before the turn of the 20th century. In 1898, he again demonstrated it at Waldorf one of the big stadiums in New York, which they could flood with water, and he put a boat basin in there, and he demonstrated he could control the boat by radio in this boat basin in New York City in one of the large stadiums, which has since been torn down. 1899, he goes to Colorado Springs to do his research, just general pure research. He wanted an area totally away from the city, in the boonies, if you will, and it was very much in the boonies. And he took power, of course, from the local power generating system, which was in Colorado Springs, built his huge Tesla coil, and he wanted to demonstrate and prove that it could prove and demonstrate conclusively that power could be transmitted a great distance without wires, without any visible means of transmission. History says, and he proved that he could do this and light bulbs 26 miles away from ground zero. But in the process of his tests and building this gigantic Tesla coil and associated apparatus, he quite literally burned out the power station in Colorado Springs. He apologized over this, and he went down and personally helped rebuild it. He also claimed that he had communications with somebody from off-planet. Well, this, of course, made great press. Whether or not anybody believed him at the time, which is hard to understand whether anybody would believe him in those days because of the very materialistic views then prevalent. But nonetheless, it made press. He closed up the operations at Colorado Springs, came back to Long Island, and of course, one of the people backing him at that time was J.P. Morgan. Morgan became at an early time quite interested in Tesla. And Tesla said, I can demonstrate radio for you. We can do something commercial with it. Of course, J.P. Morgan, being a financier, was very interested in the prospects of making vast amounts of money over this. And he authorized the building of the Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island in 1901. At that point, there was a race on to see who could first transmit a radio signal across the Atlantic from the United States or Nova Scotia. Actually, Nova Scotia was the point that was chosen for the receiving end, and the transmitting end was to be in England, or either way, whichever went first. The man who won the contest at that point was a man by the name of Marconi, Guglielmo Marconi, Italian, who was a friend of Tesla's and had visited Tesla in his laboratories in New York. And at that time, Tesla was very open with his files and many of his technical information. Oh, it's in such and such file, go take a look. Marconi did.
He visited, or Marconi?
And whether he made notes or took some of the files, history does not record. But he went back to England and to Italy, and then later to England, became involved in this contest and transmitted some Morse code signals across the Atlantic, received in Nova Scotia, and he won the international prize. Tesla was intending to win it, but did not. And of course, Mr. Tesla backer, Mr. J.P. Morgan, was perhaps a little disappointed. But then Tesla goes to Mr. Morgan and says, Mr. Morgan, what I really want to do with the Wardenclyffe Tower is demonstrate the feasibility not only of radio and television transmission, which is why it was built in the first place, as he called it at the time, transmitting sound and pictures through space, what we now call television, and of course radio. What I really want to do with this tower is to prove that you can transmit power through space and people can receive this power for free. Tesla was a visionary, and he really wanted to do something for the people of Earth, if you will. And he didn't care about the financial backgrounds and the finances of what would be a vast power network at a later date. But J.P. Morgan looked at him and says, Mr. Tesla, do you mean to tell me that somebody could put a rod of wire up in the air and another one in the ground and pick up all the power they want, and I can't put a meter on it? I will let you know when I'm ready, Mr. Tesla. He was very polite, but he obviously let Tesla know that he wasn't backing that idea. Well, the Wardenclyffe Tower was abandoned and eventually was transferred to, I believe, the Waldorf Astoria hotel system and the backers for the hotel and payment of some debts, because at that point on, Tesla was in dire need of funds because J.P. Morgan in his operations attempted to take over the Westinghouse Air Brake Company and all of Westinghouse's holdings by backing him into a corner financially. J.P. Morgan was an expert at this sort of thing. The way it was saved and Westinghouse retained control was because of the fact that he went to Tesla.
I think it says in Law of One that Tesla was sad about this when he died, because his mission for coming to Earth was to light the world up for free, to give us free electricity. Thereby, I think that would increase the amount of leisure time we had, and time to think and stuff. Prior to now, this time period harvest. So,
it says, Tesla, what am I going to do? Westinghouse and Tesla were great friends. I do not know exactly what year this occurred. But he said to him, he says, I owe you all this money. I haven't been able to pay it because of the financial problems I'm in. We're trying to keep the rail company going. We're trying to keep the dining car company going and all of this. And the whole air brake company, which, of course, Westinghouse air brakes were well known on trains and still are to this day.
Air brake?
What am I going to do? So Tesla looks at him and says, Mr. Westinghouse, would you give me those agreements we signed? I would like to look at them. He says, well, what do you want to look at them for? He says, please just get them out of the file. Let me look at them. So he answers to Tesla. Tesla looks at them and reads them, tears them in half. Westinghouse says, Mr. Tesla, what are you doing? He says, you don't owe me anything. He says, but I owe you all this money. What are you going to do? He says, Mr. Westinghouse, George, you held out your hand when everybody else turned their back. You do not owe me anything. That saved his company. He was able to pay off his debts and keep J.P. Morgan from taking over. During this period prior to World War I, Of course, Tesla kept working as best as he could. He had a business manager who tried to get his patents sold, if you will, to make some profits. Managed to hang on during this period of time. Comes World War I. He had, of course, gone to work, which not many people know, for the Marconi Company, the one that was established in the United States. In 1917, Marconi Company West, the U.S., was dissolved by the U.S. government because they felt that it was going to be a hotbed of spies and saboteurs having its Italian connection. Of course, Italy was at that time on the side of Germany, and we were fighting both of them. Tesla, of course, was without employment at the time, and that was when the Undersecretary of the Navy approached Tesla and says, I would like to have you do some government work for the war. And he said, of course. So he worked for a period of time, about 2 years. And when the war was over, there was a commission that met and decided that we need a new electronics firm. We want to combine the efforts of all of these companies, including Marconi, and establish a new organization. And all of the patents have been issued to various companies will be put in a pool and given to this new company. It became, well known today, of course, it became the Radio Corporation of America, which was established in 1919. And Tesla and most of the people who worked for Marconi were taken on board that company. Very few people know that Tesla worked for RCA from 1919 until 1939. This is one of the little things he did in the background. He was engineer, then the chief engineer, and later on, in the period between 35 and 39, when he was allegedly such a recluse, living in a little room in the Hotel New Yorker, was actually the busiest period of his life from 31 to 1939, and on into 41. He was not only the chief engineer, but eventually director of engineering and research worldwide for RCA. And they held a big retirement party for him in 1939 at Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I've never been able to locate any of the monthly bulletins which RCA put out for many, many years, but though I understand there was one showing pictures of him at the retirement party. People since have tried to trace the history of Tesla and RCA, and they can't find it. The paychecks are issued to him were not issued to him under the name of Nikola Tesla. They were issued to him under the name of Nikola Turbo, because Turbo was a nephew, and he decided to use that for whatever reasons as his official name on the records at RCA. And at some later date, all the records were destroyed. Whether this was accidental or deliberate, nobody is quite sure. But during this period, he was working on many projects. He decided to go back into, shall we say, the free energy business. And in 1931, he took a PSR automobile, ripped out the standard engine, put in a 75 horsepower electric motor, and they had a little black box, his free energy device, if you will, derived from the work he had done in the period around the turn of the century, and which Mr. J.P. Morgan wanted no part. Built this black box, converted the car to an electric motor, and had this place in the car in the dashboard for those who saw it. We put this black box and plugged it in and then turned it on, and it provided the power for the 75 horse electric motor and drove the PSR all over New York City and eventually all over New York State, without any gasoline, without any visible source of power except what he picked up. This part was documented much later by some Japanese in a video which was done many, many years later, and they said, Tesla did it better than any of us, and nobody knows how he did it. That apparently was a secret that died with him. He also developed a particle beam weapon system, which he attempted to sell to the U.S. government. At first, they were interested, then turned it down. This is a 1935-36 period, while he was working on Project Invisibility. They turned it down. The Canadians turned it down. The British government turned it down. But believe it or not, the Russian government bought it and snapped it up for $25,000 cash. Can you imagine, in view of what the financial structure is today, him selling a working model on a year's consultancy for a particle beam weapon system to the Russians or anybody for $25,000 cash? He was very hard up for money at that time. And eventually his own government gave him a stipend, which kept him alive, so to speak, during that period of time, after his paycheck was no longer available from RCA. But in fact, he was not a recluse. Of course, he knew Franklin Delano Roosevelt from some years prior, that is World War I. And when he was meeting with Roosevelt in 1933, He told Roosevelt some of the things he had done and what he was working in. And because of this and the fact that he had had a perfect track record and already had many patents to his name, Roosevelt appointed him director of Project Invisibility. Now, he's working here at this period of time on Project Invisibility, development of particle beam weapon system, free energy for a car, and who knows what else, because he had a laboratory, actually 2 laboratories in New York City in the Twin Towers of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Not well known to most people. This was found out, shall we say, after he was dead, and many, many years later doing historical research for him of his life and so forth. Preston Nichols got into this, and part of the information came from Preston due to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel Association. So we got all this equipment here. We don't know what it is or what to do with it.
Preston Nichols
Preston was heavily involved in surplus equipment.
These guys.
And he went over to look at it and saw it, and he realized whose equipment it was, and of course he acquired it for a song. He also allegedly had a secret laboratory in New Jersey. I have papers in my file which allude to this. And of course, he also was working at this time for the Institute of Advanced Study. At a later date, when I was doing historical research as Al Bielek into the life of Tesla and the fact that he worked at the Institute, the curator there, I asked him, do you have a file on Tesla? He says, well, not really. He says, no one who didn't work here and actually receive a paycheck from the Institute did we have a file on. But he went and dug in his files and he said, we do have a folder on Nikola Tesla. And he showed it to me. It was a telegram sent to the Institute from New York saying that Nikola Tesla had died on the 7th of January, 1943, and announcing the plans for his funeral. This is getting a little ahead of the story, of course, but this was the only thing they had in the file. And it was interesting that they had that. But it made it quite clear to me, many people come and go in the Institute who are involved in various projects the Institute is funding and who are there as consultants. If they're not on staff, we don't keep basically a file. But back to the period of time when Tesla was involved with this project, it was because of these things. He had an incredible and impeccable reputation. And all during this time, of course, in fact, through his entire life, he never married. To get to the more personal side of Tesla, in the early period when he was in the United States, in the period around 1884 to 1890, one of the people he met was the publisher of the Century magazine, very well known at that time. And the man was married and had a wife. And Tesla was introduced to his wife and so forth, and immediately, shall we say, the sparks flew. And there was this attraction. This kind of thing, of course, you cannot explain appropriately, except it is a feeling which exists between two people, which is like a magnetic pull, and nobody understands why except it's there. And there's this attraction mutually between the two of them. Well, Tesla was an absolute gentleman. He refused to make any kind of a pass or overture to his wife, the man who published Century magazine. And she, of course, and as women in those days were far more demure, she just didn't do anything except be totally polite to Mr. Tesla. They met many times because there was a lot of correspondence and a lot of reporting being done by the head of the Century magazine on some of Tesla's work. But he never married. That was the only woman who he's ever known to have been interested in his entire life. And eventually she faded out of his life. So the rest of his life, it's not known that he ever had any female relationships. He was totally devoted to his work. And
scan in on that, and then I'm going to come back. When you start getting off the book or talking, I'll get back. So when you see 3 fingers, we're up.
And speaking of Tesla and his lifetime, there's a lot of research that's been done about his life after he died. There were perhaps not that many people during his lifetime who were concerned with what he was doing, other than those who were directly connected. This particular book, written, of course, after he had passed on, by Margaret Cheney, Tesla Man Out of Time, is most interesting. Many books have been written about Tesla, but at least on the cover it has a picture of Tesla as he appeared in his later years. There are many pictures extant of Tesla from the time he was a young man until he was in the U.S., and of course, after he was in the U.S., he changed his appearance quite a bit. He wanted to give the scientific or professorial look, so he grew a mustache, his hair darkened, and the usual pictures of Tesla though perhaps younger than this one, showed him in a very similar way, in a very similar outline. The group that had the best collection of pictures was the now defunct Tesla Society of Colorado Springs, Colorado. They went belly up a few years ago. They had a great collection of pictures of Tesla. I never did get all of them. And one of them showed him as a very young man, in which he was an extremely good-looking person. It's surprising in many ways that he never married and that he never had any close relationships, but many tales have been told about him, and he was so totally devoted to his work, apparently he bypassed everything else. And I'll go back now to the
people like this, males and females. It's totally
later part of the life of Tesla. One of the people whom I met, who, when he was still alive, namely Mr. Ralph Bergstresser, was a principal technician for many years for Mr. Tesla. He told me many interesting anecdotes, many interesting stories. Tesla, of course, was known for years to have a room he lived in, if that's the proper term, at the Hotel New Yorker. It was not a very large room, not very large quarters. But he also had for many years an original laboratory in New York City back around the turn of the century and later, which was burned out with a fire. He lost most of his equipment. But later on, he had two laboratories in the towers of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And he had some facilities there which he used for many years. He also had facility in New Jersey, and of course, during the period of the time which we were discussing the Philadelphia experiment, he had a secret lab someplace in New Jersey, as well as his occasional and not regular visits to the Institute of Advanced Study. While he was not only the consultant but the director of the project, he had other things going, so he was getting around quite a bit. Tesla was a very energetic man, very much devoted to his research, all during the period right up to the time of his death. Bergstresser knew a great deal about Tesla, and he told me some stories about the electronic equipment he had. Tesla, of course, did work for RCA Corporation from 1919 at the time of its inception until just before, a few years before Tesla's death. From 35 to 39, he was, of course, the Director of Engineering and Research worldwide for RCA. And he had a retirement party at Cherry Hill, New Jersey in 1939. So that was one of the reasons why he didn't show up at the Institute that often. After 1939, he had a lot more free time, as I'm sure his duties at the RCA Corporation in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, where I believe he worked most of the time, were very demanding. But Tesla, as he went on, became more involved with this project. He had a great insight, and his approaches, or I should say his approach to the idea of the object of invisibility is most interesting. Now, his ideas were not only mathematical but electronic, but in addition to the work that he did and his approaches, there were other people who theoretically fit into the whole background of this project. Remember, it started in 1931 in Chicago at the University of Chicago, and then was moved in 1933 to the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. There are a number of things in the background which are very important. One of the people who was very important to this project was a mathematician known as Dr. David Hilbert in Germany. He dates from before the turn of the 20th century, lived until sometime in the 50s. So far as I know, he never left Germany. But he developed many systems of mathematics, 5 in actual count, for which the last one was the most important. It became nicknamed Hilbert Space because his mathematics described multiple realities and means for, shall we say, connecting to them, at least theoretically, to the alternate realities. Among the people who was in Germany at that time, of course, was Dr. John von Neumann, who I've given very little history of at this point. But he took a degree in chemistry in 1925 and a PhD in physics in mathematics in 1926, taught in the German university systems for approximately 4 years before he came to the United States in 1930. During this period of time, of course, he met David Hilbert, learned a great deal of his mathematics, And von Neumann, in his most inimitable way, went on and developed some more of his own mathematics, things known as operators, polar operators, and what became known as the von Neumann algebra eventually, to make it perhaps more palatable to a student. These were some of the people who figured in the background. Hilbert made his contributions in terms of mathematics, which was brought over to the United States basically by Dr. John von Neumann, who was on staff full-time there, working perhaps most of the time on the project itself. The approach which Tesla used, the approach which Tesla used was basically the same approach which was used in the later experiments. In the earlier phase, involving, of course, the test in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a very small ship, some rather scaled-down equipment was used, but the basic idea remained the same. One has to understand the four basic energetic systems of our physical universe. A little bit of theory here. I'm not going to get into math and highly involved because this is not intended to be a scientific dissertation, but a more popular presentation of the ideas of what was going on. I'm sure everybody has heard about electric fields, both static and, of course, current flow as the AC system.
Remember, Al Bielek said this is not supposed to be a scientific dissertation. Like, he could go deep, and you'll find out later he can go a lot deeper in describing time, our reality, things of that sort. But here we go.
Use today and have used since before the turn of the 20th century. There are electric fields, of course there are magnetic fields, and everybody I'm sure has heard about magnetic fields, but I'm quite sure very few people ever heard about a gravity field, because Sir Isaac Newton's idea when the apple hit him on the head, as per the stories of yore, that he propounded the theory of gravity in which all matter had an attraction for all other matter, and the mass of the planet determined the strength of the gravitic field. Happens to be incorrect. But there's not much in the way of outside literature published in the open domain which indicates, other than the speculative ideas, that gravity is a field, an external field around the body like the Earth or any other object. And it's extremely important that when I know the idea of a gravity field, because this is what we were using to create a means of access to the time field. Now that again is another new idea, because not many people outside of the, let's say, the hardcore scientific field, the hardcore scientific community, really understand that time is not an illusion, but is an actual fact in the form of a field. Without a blackboard and such, I cannot give you much of an idea what I'm talking about, but I'll attempt to do this, shall we say, off the cuff without actual physical representation. The gravity field, the electric field, and the magnetic field are all interlocked. If you consider or mentally look at an idea of, let's say, a triangle, an equilateral triangle of some size, point up, you can assign it in any way you wish, but at the 3 points, the 3 apexes of this equilateral triangle, one will be E for electric field, one will be H for the magnetic field, and the other will be G for gravitic field. If you interconnect these fields by electronics and electronic means, and that takes a great deal of math and took many years to understand how to do it, but this is what Tesla came up with, and of course the rest of the people at the Institute. You set up electronics and electronic means to properly interact with these three fields, you then access automatically the time field. When you access the time field, and this of course is in a small localized area, depending upon how much power you put into this, you access it and you can manipulate the time field within a small, or perhaps not quite so small, area for effects which are local. If you visualize a donut.
Yo, I just said to myself, oh shoot, the beginning of Meta World, or what I call Meta World. In 2028, time travel will be revealed on our way to it. How we decide how we're going to go forward with the world. It's like it's Meta World for me. It's Meta going beyond, and then the world, Meta World. Hey guys, my name's here on Meta. That's my nickname, so everyone calls me not Mr. You can call me Mr. Meta, but not to be confused with Meta as in the meta platforms. A lot of people got tired of when I first started. I would call me Mr. Metaphysical. Started calling me Mr. Meta, then just call me Meta. So this is crazy. It's crazy. Tesla was a harbinger of this really new age and everything that's coming now. Everything that's happening now.
This would be the easiest way to do it. A toroid, but let's say a donut, which everybody I think has seen. But a toroidal structure resembling a donut. This thing is a closed circuit. Time is a closed loop. This is very advanced math, very vast concepts, in which there is quite literally no beginning and no ending. There is a point which one can say is plus and minus infinity. This is a mathematical concept, which perhaps doesn't have any direct feeling in reality. But this is a concept. There is a point, you might say, is the beginning and the ending, the alpha and the omega. And you can go through that point, but we're not there. We're at some point in the time field, and in the terms of this torus or donut, if one describes a line around the edge, such as a full circumferential line, enclosing the torus, enclosing this donut, this is the reality line of time as we understand it, time being three vectors, but the first vector, T1, the so-called fourth dimension, is time as we know it, time as we measure it with a clock, as we can measure it astronomically by the movement and the position of the stars. This is fairly easy to grasp. Time also has another aspect, another vector called T2, which is at right angles with the first. Now, if the time we understand and measure is along the edges of this torus, or this donut, if you look at the donut as a three-dimensional object, you can describe a certain amount of circumferential rotation around it. You can literally trace around the donut fully around one edge, and as you go, if it's a helix, you go around the whole donut describing it. This is T2. It is at right angles to the linear flow. And this right angle coil, if you will, is the second vector of time. We don't measure that, but it is the one which controls T1. Now, what we were doing, and we're speaking now theoretically, is accessing the time field, and in order to access time itself, if I use that term, you have to go one order higher in order to affect everything that's below it. Going one order higher is when you go to T2 and you affect T2, and therefore you can control within that limited area that you're working with, because the force of the electronics and the artificial field you create doesn't go through the whole Earth, through the whole universe. It's very much restricted, depending on how much power you have to affect the immediate area. This is one reason why they went to such high power in the early experiments, not the very first one Tesla did in 1940, but the subsequent ones. And that is the problem, which developed extremely high power, which became very destructive to the nervous systems of the sailors. But by doing this, you access time with the other three forces, and because of that, you can create a localized time field, and you can then play games with it. When I say games, again, I'm speaking mathematically and in theory. And what you can do, if you could create a field large enough to surround an object, whether it be this table or, say, a larger object like a ship.
I saw y'all laughing because I'm like, man, this is years ahead. This is like, these people are way ahead of us, man. And I hear Trump saying to the reporter, hey, man, the Trump said, no. You don't get to talk to me like that. You're a small fry. You don't get to talk to me like that. So, oh, man. So it's tough, you know. We'll get into it. We'll get back into it.
Which is what, of course, we're concerned with. What you are doing is creating a field, literally a donut or torus field around that ship. The ship is in the hole, so to speak, but the fields are around it, and it affects time around that ship. Therefore, you can rotate the time field slightly as you go away from the line of reference, which we call time, or T1, T0 if you want to call it that. As you go away from that by creating a field which starts a rotation around the edge of this donut, you'll get to a point at approximately 60 degrees rotation where light passes through the object. It is then invisible. The only reason it is invisible, it's still there. The only reason it's invisible is because there is no longer a reflection of energy. If you reflect light, the radar energy, you will get energy fed back to you. You will see it, a camera will record it, or the radar system, of course, will record a return of energy and create an image. No return, no image, i.e.
This is important because this is what what the Philadelphia experiment is about, that Tesla worked on, making a ship invisible.
It's invisible. That sounds very simple. It's really not. There are other means for, let's say, portraying or actually creating an idea of invisibility. There are other systems proposed. One of the magicians went to the Navy many, many years ago and says, I can create a illusion which can be made effective to make a whole ship invisible. The Navy listened to this man and then classified the whole project and everything he said. So nobody knows what it is he really said. Apparently the Navy thought enough of it, they thought they had better classify it. There are other ideas which have been proposed, but there's one other aspect of this I want to make clear. There are certain chemical solutions, I at the moment forget what they are. If you put them in a glass and set the glass, let's say, on a table, the chemical solution, if it has the same index of refraction as the glass, becomes totally invisible. You can't see it in the glass. This is essentially what I'm trying to say. If you make the index of refraction in the area where the ship is 1, there's nothing there to see. It's there, but you can't see it, just like the chemical solution inside the glass. You can't see it. Water you can see, it's close to the same index of refraction as glass, but it's not the same. It's different than air. It bends light. Because it bends light, you see the water. Light will bounce off of an object or it will go through it. And depending on whether it goes through without obstruction, such as very good window glass, essentially all the light goes through it and you don't see it. And glass, of course, is a combination of basically oxygen, silica, and a few other chemicals. And it's almost pure oxygen, which perhaps most people don't know. But there are many ideas, and the basic one we were working with was very complex. It required enormous amounts of power. But an initial test that as Tesla did, as he conducted this in 1940, didn't require the power that was used later. And they did take the precaution. All personnel were removed from the ship when they had the power turned on, and the ship was completely invisible to sight or to a camera. Radar is nothing but electromagnetic energy at a lower frequency than light. So if you can make it invisible to light, theoretically it's invisible to radar, which did prove to be the case at a later point. Tesla was involved with this all the way up through March of 1942. With that successful test, what happened was, of course, that Roosevelt got the news and he says, well, Mr. Tesla, I'm going to give you a real ship now. I'm going to give you a battleship. If you can make that invisible, you can make anything invisible. So a battleship was moved into the backyard of the Philadelphia Navy Yard in the area which is at that time was for classified work, classified efforts. Tesla went to work, of course, to prepare the equipment for that. And of course, he was backed up by the people at the Institute. I mean, he was not working alone. He had John von Neumann working, he had Einstein there as a consultant, and other people who became involved, including a man by the name of T. Townsend Brown, who was a Navy man in the reserves. He had a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. I'm not going to go into his whole history. But in 1938, he was pulled out of the Navy Reserves into a full-time commission and then assigned to a number of projects. But one of them he was involved with the Philadelphia experiment. He contributed a lot of work in terms of the RF systems, particularly the antenna system, which was used to create the electric field. And that was one of his contributions to the experiment. He perhaps is better known for the fact that he worked on the degaussing systems, and he developed the degaussing systems for the German magnetic mines. In the early stages of that, they used to wrap cables around the entire ship, create a pulsed magnetic field strong enough so that if a magnetic mine was near the ship, they would, at a safe distance, would be exploded. Not too near the ship, obviously. The magnetic mine worked not by contact of a probe, but by the proximity of a large mass of iron or steel, which of course all the ships were then. Today there's a lot of them aluminum, the hulls of the smaller ships. It would detect the mass of metal. change the magnetic flux of a magnetic system inside the mine, trip it, and of course would explode, theoretically would blow the ship apart without any physical contact with the ship. That system, of course, the Germans developed about 1938. T. Townsend Brown found the remedy, if you will, for it. And that was one of the things he did. And it did bear some relationship to what came later in the Philadelphia experiment. Some people, such as John J. O'Neill, thought it was nothing but an extension of T. Townsend Brown's work on the magnetic mines. It was not. There was similar technology involved, but only a small part of it. When this battleship arrived in the harbor and then up into the Philadelphia Navy Yard in January of 1940, approximately, it was perhaps a little earlier than that, but in any case, at that time, Duncan and myself were tapped on the shoulder by the brass, if you will, in the Navy and said, "You're in the Navy as officers. It's time you found out what the Navy is really all about." Because up to that point, we'd had very little contact with the Navy. It was almost entirely working at the Institute. Aside from that fact, of course, we had a social life. It was quite easy, and around Princeton and that whole area, of course, there were a lot of social activities. We were part of it. We took part when we could. Because at that point, before the war started, there was not dawn to dusk and then all-night type operations. It was on essentially 8 to 5 basis. So we'd go out and do various things, and we'd have a social life, and we'd do some dating, and eventually, a little bit later, I became engaged to a woman to marry, but that became the case in 1943. In that period, we had some social life. We went around, we learned a lot about Philadelphia, because it's not that far from Philadelphia. It had a great deal of social life going. There were a number of people I remember dating. And of course, being that I came from the Cameron family, and there's a certain degree of prestige to that. And of course, you wear a white officer's Navy uniform. I mean, the women were falling all over you. In this case, they were falling all over me and Duncan. Duncan was still the better looking of us. We never had any problems, shall we say, socially. The problem was how to fit the social life into the work life. That was an interesting competition. When we went to the sea in the Navy, of course, that ended. And we were all over the Pacific until October of 1941. The Pennsylvania came into dry dock at Pearl Harbor. It was due for an overhaul. It, of course, had been launched in 1916, commissioned in 1916. It was a quite old battleship, actually, but still, shall we say, very seaworthy. It was a favorite of Roosevelt, and it was, at that point, the flagship of the fleet. It went into Pearl Harbor, into dry dock. We took leave, first in Hawaii, then we went to San Francisco. And on December 5th, 1941, we were about to board a Navy plane at the Alameda Naval Air Station when we were intercepted by a Navy captain that says, "Gentlemen, your orders are canceled. Come with me." Amen. And we followed him into an upstairs room at the Naval Air Station and met Hal Bowen Sr. This was the first time we'd met him. He was the director of the Office of Naval Engineering, as they called it in those days. It's since been renamed the Office of Naval Research. And he says, "Gentlemen, your orders are canceled. We have reason to believe the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor within 48 to 72 hours, and we don't want you there. Stay here in San Francisco. It's the home port of the Pennsylvania. So there may be some paperwork and things you can do, but take all the time you want off. Have a good time. In January, you go back to the Institute, and there'll be nothing but hard work, I can assure you." So we did exactly that. We continued our leave, if you will, in San Francisco. Had an absolute ball. San Francisco was always wide open for sailors, and we didn't have any problems. And of course, history records that on December 7th, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. It was known in advance by certain people in the Navy and in the military and the brass. And it was known in advance, as I found out many, many years later, as Al Bielek, by a woman whose husband at that time was stationed in Pearl Harbor in 1941. And it was interesting to note that the people expected an attack for 2 months prior to December 7th, but nobody knew whether it would come or when. All the male population of the island of Hawaii, I should say the island of Oahu, which was where Pearl Harbor was, were armed. The military gave sidearms to every male of appropriate age, 18 or over, on the island, expecting an invasion. Now, the population expected it there 2 months before it actually happened. What about all of the hoopla afterwards that it was a surprise sneak attack? Oh, yes, we were surprised, all right, because, shall we say, it was set up in order to get us into the war. That is, of course, a part of history I do not wish to deal with at this point. It's not necessary.
Major claim.
But we were not there when it happened. In January, we returned, of course, to the Institute of Advanced Studies, January 1942, and preparations were underway, well advanced for the test on the battleship. Now, they did not want to cut into the deck of the battleship in order to, shall we say, bury machinery and equipment below decks. If the ship were being built and there was known that they wanted to put this type of equipment on board a ship, then they would have made preparations for a space to store the equipment. But this was, of course, the first stage of a series of experiments. So everything was lashed to the decks and the heavy equipment was on the dockside. Tesla, getting back and talking with him, was very concerned about the fact that his calculation showed you had to go up to many, many times the power, almost 100 times the power used for the initial test. And we're talking megawatts of RF energy and many kilowatts of electrical energy through the coils. You designed 4 coils to go on the deck of the ship, whatever ship it might be, which were conical. You loved them, I'd add, conical coils instead of the flat ribbon wound or the typical type that you wind on the core of a transformer, which is flat, layer by layer. These coils were spirally wound. Small at one end, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. He considered them more efficient. He even made flat coils, which were spirally wound. He said they were more efficient than the standard techniques then being used, and to this day being used. But these coils stood something over 6 feet high, about 6.5 feet high. They were copper tubing, approximately 1.75 inches in diameter, hollow, because they had to pump coolant water through them in the final stages, in the final design. And one cable connecting the top and, of course, one at the bottom. They'd sit 4 of these on the deck of the ship, whatever one it was, whether it was a battleship or whether it was a later work on the Eldridge. And they would be pumped with AC power from special alternators which were designed for this job. They provided the magnetic field. The electric field was internal to this. There was a special antenna which was designed in the stages for the battleship and on as a quadriphase antenna, which means there were 4 segments 90 degrees apart around, shall we say, the periphery of a mounting tube. And these things are sort of embedded. Because it was high frequency, they can embed it as a rod, insulated, 90 degrees displaced from each other. So you had them in a 4 quadrant, so to speak, of a circle, 90 degrees apart. And each one of those are fed separately with an RF system, where the energy that was pumped to them was 90 degrees out of phase with the next one, and so forth around the whole circle. By proper use of much electronics, separate from the antenna and separate from the coils, you would produce a rotating field, a rotating electric field and a rotating magnetic field. The electric field rotated counterclockwise inside the magnetic field, and the magnetic field also rotated counterclockwise. Excuse me. The interaction of those 2 fields in relationship to much other unmentioned mathematics, and still classified for that matter, even though the Philadelphia experiment today has been essentially declassified because of a 50-year limit on classification of anything unless a special dispensation to keep it going longer, will not, I'm certain, show the mathematics. I have not had access to those records, even though I've tried to get them. There are ways of keeping people from getting them, even though it's declassified. I'm speaking of the current time. Going back to that time, the power was quite excessive, and Tesla knew it. But I might add that in terms of the knowledge of the effects of electric and magnetic fields on the human body and the human nervous system.
So y'all, we'll come back here sooner than later. Probably pick up part 3. But yeah, as you can see, Al Bielek is definitely knows what he's talking about. He was definitely, I can't say he was definitely there. He alleges he was there as, Ed Cameron. But he's a knowledgeable man, older guy, and this is before he left us in 2011. So I'll see you in the next video, and hope you so far enjoyed. Support Channel 3X, y'all. Credits goes out to them, Channel 3X, for this, and we'll see you next time.